Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our fifth and final installment of the lifelong learning series on sustainability. We began with an introductory program titled, "What Do We Mean by Sustainability?" We moved to food, farms, and fisheries, and then into planet water. We moved into alternative energy sources. What is the path of sustainability? And tonight we conclude with financial realities. You might say where the rubber meets the road. Can we afford a sustainable future? We're going to address the financial questions surrounding sustainability. We'll begin with W&L economics professor Jim Casey, who has a master's and a PhD from North Carolina State. He will survey the myriad components of a cost-benefit analysis of sustainable development, both nationally and globally, and he will give you very clearly his own opinion of the choice we face. Kurt Harrison is the father of Washington and Lee Jr. Lindsay Harrison. He is the co-head of the Global ESG and Sustainability Practice at worldwide executive search firm Russell Reynolds Associates. Kurt's going to explain the basic concepts behind ESG and review the strong movement in corporate America towards investments based on environmental, social, and governance considerations. Ms. Alex Prather, W&L class of 2014, is currently earning a dual MBA and Master's in Public Affairs at MIT's Sloan School of Management and Harvard's Kennedy School. She has valuable experience in the climate tech and climate policy sectors of the venture capital industry, and she will highlight the assessment and funding of some new technical innovations for carbon removal from the Earth's atmosphere. Professor Casey, lead us off and give us the overview of the financial realities of a sustainable future.
Thank you, Bo. Appreciate the introduction and welcome everyone to the last of our series. I'm going to go ahead and share, hopefully do this correctly. Turn on, hopefully everyone can see just that slide that says, can we afford sustainability? Excellent. So that's the big question, can we afford sustainability? And I would like to suggest that it is actually the wrong question. That the correct question, or the right question is, can we afford not to be more sustainable? And hopefully by the end of my presentation, it'll make sense as to why I've flipped that question around. Before we move forward, I think it's important first to go back. And on the very first day, about a month ago, the very first seminar or webinar that we did, we started with defining sustainability and talking about the practical implications of sustainable development. And I suggested to our audience that using very broad strokes that we could think about sustainable development by asking these three questions. Can we produce enough energy and not destroy the planet? Can we produce enough food and not destroy the planet? And can we eliminate poverty and not destroy the planet? Given the time constraints of tonight, I'm only going to focus on the energy aspect of sustainability. It's hard for a university professor to have 15 minutes to cover a semester's worth of material. But I'm going to do the best I possibly can. And we're going to focus in on the costs associated with producing energy, in particular, the cost associated with climate change and the cost associated with climate policy. I forgot to mention that the answer to all three of these questions is yes, and not a matter of can we do these things, but will we do these things? Before we get started down this path, I'd like you to keep in mind what's called the 1% principle. Those of you who are old enough will remember in 2001, Vice President Cheney was quoted as saying, if there's even a 1% chance of the unimaginable coming due, we need to act as if it is a certainty. Now, granted, he was talking about global terrorism, but I think the same applies to thinking about energy resources and climate change. And the quote by Marty Weitzman from a 2011 paper that he wrote, Marty was a professor at Harvard University. He said, I believe that the most striking feature of the economics of climate change is that its extreme downside is non-negligible. And if you dig into the details of that paper, you will find that he suggests there is a greater than 1% probability of catastrophic climate change, which I would call unsustainable by definition. And so therefore, just keep this in mind, this idea of a 1% principle. The rest of my talk, I'm going to be providing you with sort of bullet points about these different costs associated with climate change and climate policy. And I have a myriad of links to the papers and projects that I use to put this together. And this presentation should be available to anyone who would like access to it, I believe, through the Office of Lifelong Learning afterward, if they want to dig into all of the details, which I do not have time to go into tonight. So we start with the costs of climate change. So these are dollar figures that have been attributed to things that are happening in our environment due to the warming of our atmosphere, the warming of the planet. The United Nations Environment Program last year put out a report that suggests it will cost between $300 and $500 billion annually for developing countries simply to adapt to the climate change that is already occurring. And this estimate runs out through 2050. And I think one of the important things to keep in mind here, in addition to these dollar amounts, is that in the developing countries, which have the fewest resources to provide basic access to health services, education services, the elimination of poverty, the elimination of hunger, this is $300 to $500 billion that has to be averted from those types of development programs simply to adapt to the changes in the environment that are taking place. And for most of the people who are most affected by climate change, who will be bearing the brunt of this, they are in fact the least responsible for the changes that we're seeing in the atmosphere in terms of temperature and the associated climate changes. Deloitte put out a paper earlier this year suggesting that in the United States alone, the cost of climate change, if left unchecked, could reach $14.5 trillion by 2070. And I realize 2070 may seem like a long ways into the future, but just to put that into perspective, 2070 is as far away from today as 1974 is as far away from today. And at least in my mind, that's not that long ago, quite frankly. And little basketball trivia, college basketball trivia, North Carolina State Wolfpack won the national championship in 1974. So shout out to my Wolfpack bow. The last piece here was a paper that was published in Nature by a group of economists at Berkeley and Stanford suggesting that it was possible for the world to see a 23% reduction in incomes by 2100 with widening global income inequalities relative to scenarios without climate change. So these are numbers, right? These are the quantification of changes, but what are those actual changes that are occurring in the world that we're putting dollar values on? And I'm only going to talk about a couple of them, and quite frankly, just the ones that appeared to be most salient to most people in the context of thinking about climate change. The first of which is thinking about the frequency and the intensity of wildfires. They are on the rise. The intensity of these fires and the economic damages associated with them are rising and are predicted to continue to rise into the near and far future. The second, as warming continues, the permafrost melting, which releases new greenhouse gases, which in fact contribute to more warming. So putting us on more than just a linear path, but rather the potential for an increasing rate of climate change at additionally an increasing rate. So the melting of the permafrost is one of the consequences of living in a warmer world. The most salient feature of climate change, according to most surveys, is sea level rise. And whether it's the evening commute in Tybee Island, Georgia, affected by sea level rise and coastal flooding, or it happens to be the afternoon streetscape in places like Alexandria, Virginia, which is where I think this picture was taken, or in Charleston, South Carolina, or any of the other myriad coastal cities. Nuisance flooding, some days king tide flooding on days where it's perfectly sunny, but at high tide and a full moon, there's actually flooding from the intrusion of seawater below the surface, pushing fresh water up. And a recent study put out by an interdisciplinary group of scientists in the US predicts that we might see up to a foot more of sea level rise along the coast of the eastern coast of the United States of America. So these are the kinds of changes that economists are trying to put dollar figures on to understand the true costs to our economy, to individuals, to firms, to communities, et cetera, of the changes that we're seeing in the environment. This last picture returns to that issue of those who are bearing the primary cost or the largest cost associated with climate change are those that are least likely to have the resources to deal with that, and raises a whole host of questions in addition to just the quantification of those costs, the equity and the justice issues associated with that as well. So these are 7 links to some different papers and projects that I think could be very useful if you want to dig into more of those details. And again, this presentation should be available after the webinar is over. So now flipping sides here, let's think about the costs of climate policy. So what if we decide to do something to mitigate, right, the burning of hydrocarbons and hence the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? The first 2 bullet points up there are based on what are called macroeconomic modeling, trying to understand the effects on the overall economy. And Sir Nicholas Stern published a paper maybe close to a decade ago now, suggesting that we could actually stabilize greenhouse gas emissions with about 1% of global GDP per year in spending. The paper that came out of MIT several years ago suggests maybe 2 times or 3 times that amount, that in order to reduce 80% of our carbon emissions by 2050, it might cost us 2 to 3% of GDP. So again, putting that into perspective, these are estimates that suggest anywhere between a penny to 3 pennies on the dollar in order to implement policies that can reduce carbon emissions by up to 80% by 2050. And that's sort of the target for thinking about stabilizing global temperatures. The last report is a relatively recent one put out by Morgan Stanley, suggesting that stopping global warming will cost $50 trillion. And I want to point out that there are some cost estimates in here that are very problematic. Part of the difficulty of understanding any of this is, what do you count as a cost? And in this particular paper, they count spending on new infrastructure, spending on factories, the building of electric cars and windmills and solar panels. They count all of those as costs to the economy. And I would argue, as an economist, that those are inputs to production, that they are costs of doing business, but that they generate revenues associated with them. And so the calculation of cost is a very important piece. And the way I'll frame this for you is to ask this question: does anyone think that Elon Musk considers this a cost, right? He's just building Tesla factories for the heck of spending money. No, there's a lot of profit involved in it. And so again, I think we need to think very carefully about what we count as costs and what we count as inputs to production in an economy that does not exist primarily through the burning of hydrocarbons, but rather uses wind, water, solar. A couple other examples, right? We need to develop offshore wind capabilities. Here we're looking at a picture of the largest solar farm in Arkansas of almost 500 acres. And I would argue that the farmer who leased this land to this company certainly doesn't see it as a cost, but rather a huge benefit of decarbonizing our economic activity. In addition, large-scale land-based wind farms. And I'm not going to argue that there are no environmental costs associated with any of these. There are clearly aesthetic costs, viewscape costs, et cetera, potential damages to wildlife, changes in a rural aesthetic. All of those, I think, need to be counted as costs, and recognizing that an alternative energy future, or a future where we attempt to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, does come with some price as well, or some cost. And one of the very interesting ones, I think, is thinking about if the entire transportation system on planet Earth is going to run on electric batteries, we're going to need an awful lot of lithium. Recently, the Salton Sea has been seen as an example of a place where people are talking about California's next gold rush. And there's a lot of activity in thinking about the amount of lithium that may be able to be harvested from the Salton Sea in Southern California. Again, that will provide tremendous economic benefits, but there's certainly going to be some cost associated with that as well. So what is the primary cost then associated with climate policy? And I would argue that the price of fuel. We live in a world where 85 to 90% of our fuel consumption is based on hydrocarbons, that being coal, all forms of natural gas and petroleum. And this clearly, right, is the area that we need to reduce in order to put ourselves on a more sustainable path. And so I would argue that the primary cost of climate policy are the short-run adjustments of seeing increases in the prices of energy as we gravitate towards a zero emissions energy sector that provides the inputs to all of our economic activity. Again, in terms of cost of climate policy, digging a little bit deeper, there's some excellent work at Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C., running the simulations, the macroeconomic models, looking at the distribution of costs to households in the United States, and the shift in the wealth creation from the fossil fuel industry potentially to other industries. And so I think that begs the question then of what can and should we do if we're thinking about this path of moving towards more sustainable energy infrastructure and more sustainable economic production and consumption. And the most straightforward piece of economics that I could talk about straight out of the Principles of Economics course is that prices have to be right in a market. And this might not be, or might not sound quite as straightforward, but the idea is that if the price in a market doesn't reflect the true cost associated with the production and consumption of any good or service that's being provided, then it is by definition inefficient. We are either overusing or underutilizing resources if the price does not reflect the true cost. And here are just two examples of things that we currently do, one related to climate change, the other related to food production. We heavily subsidize fossil fuels on planet Earth. A recent International Monetary Fund report suggests that potentially up to 6.8% of global GDP is spent simply subsidizing fossil fuel production on planet Earth. Remember, the calculation by MIT was a 2 to 3% of GDP for an 80% reduction. We might ask ourselves, where do those finances come from? They could come directly from eliminating the subsidies on fossil fuels. The farm subsidy pales in comparison, but I think it's just interesting to think about food production and its sustainable path forward when, in fact, we spend $22.6 billion worth of taxpayers' dollars every year subsidizing farming in the United States. So the first and foremost, the simplest solution that I think any economist would recommend is that there just absolutely has to be a price on carbon, a price on all greenhouse gases. It's a simple solution, it's a necessary solution, but it's certainly not a sufficient solution. But there has been consensus around this issue in terms of taxing what we call negative externalities or pollution associated with production and consumption that dates back at least 100 years in the economics literature. And Greg Mankiw, this was my first introduction to social media. I actually joined Facebook in 2006 so I could become a member of the Pagoo Club. And that is a club of economists who were arguing back in 2006 for a carbon tax. And for those of you who may not know, Greg Mankiw is a chaired professor in the economics department at Harvard and served as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors during the George W. Bush administration. As far back in my professional career as a little bit over a decade ago, I was giving talks suggesting back in 2011 that I thought maybe we could start at about $5 a ton, ratchet that up to about $50 a ton by 2020, and get to $100 a ton per ton of carbon emissions by 2030. Needless to say, we're at 2022 and we're still at zero in terms of a tax on carbon emissions. And so in many respects, we are pretty far behind the curve in terms of thinking about domestic policy to address this particular issue. Sadly, right, there's politics involved in all of this. And so what I've provided here in the More on Carbon Pricing is a paper by the Carbon Leadership Council, or the Climate Leadership Council, excuse me, which is called The Conservative Case for Carbon Tax and Dividends, and another paper by the People's Policy Project called The Progressive Case for a Carbon Tax and Dividends. As I like to share with my students, there's no need for the word conservative or progressive to be at the front of either one of these policy proposals, because the policy proposals are basically the same. They just couch these things in different language to appeal to different constituencies. And quite frankly, right, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, you consider yourself a Republican or a Democrat, it doesn't matter in the context of thinking about climate change and a sustainable energy future. We all have to be in this together. And I think these are two great papers illustrating that there is support on the right and there is support on the left for these types of proposals. So I never like to finish a conversation like this on a down note. So I'm going to introduce you to who I would consider to be three game changers in this area, and three people who I think can provide us with some hope and make us feel good about the potential path that we can get on moving forward here. The first is Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, and she's a marine biologist who works right at the intersection of ocean policy and management and climate change. I highly recommend her book, All We Can Save, and the All We Can Save project that she and some other scientists have been putting together. And as that says, she works right there at the nexus of science, policy, and communication. She is an excellent communicator. And again, I think is a game changer for all of us. The second is Texas Tech's Kate Hayhoe. She is absolutely one of the world's most respected climate scientists. And she also happens to be an evangelical Christian who lives in West Texas. And she has sort of made it her work to communicate her science to groups of individuals and communities who are most skeptical and doubtful about the type of work that she does. And again, I think just a phenomenal communicator, someone who brings people together. And luckily for us, Kate will actually be giving a webinar in March through the MUD series, the ethics series at the MUD Center. So if anyone's interested, you could get a chance to hear Kate Hayhoe give a talk on climate change and climate policy. And lastly, someone who you'll be hearing from in just a few minutes is Alex Prather. She is the co-president of the MIT Energy and Climate Club. And I'll share a little secret that I say to my students every night before you go to bed: pray for MIT is what I tell them, because that's where the solutions will be coming from. Lastly, another slide with some more resources and more detail in case you're interested in digging a little bit deeper. And I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Kurt Harrison.
Jim, thank you. You're quite right in triggering our thanks to you for cramming a semester's worth of knowledge and questions into about 15 minutes. So appreciate that, and all the links will be available later to our audience. I neglected to mention at the outset that one of the most rewarding parts of these sessions for us is the Q&A, which will follow all three of our speakers. The way to do that is to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not chat, not raise hand, but rather go ahead and use the Q&A function as they occur to you. Rob Fury and Ruth Candler, who run the lifelong learning department, will field those questions, get them curated, and offer them to our speakers at the end of the three presentations. So please don't hesitate to send them on in. And now, Kurt, with apologies for the delay, Kurt Harrison will talk to us about ESG.
Well, thank you, Bo, and thank you, Professor Casey. I feel like I'm the impediment here, making everyone wait for Alex, because I know I cannot wait for Alex's presentation as well. So I'm Kurt Harrison. I'm based here in Virginia, the proud father of a W&L junior, Lindsay Harrison. And I also work for the global executive search firm, Russell Reynolds Associates. And my job is to basically recruit global heads and leadership of ESG and sustainability for our clients around the world. So it's a very interesting time to be involved in this space. I'm sure everyone is very familiar at this point with ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. And there are many different ways to think about ESG. And when people ask me, is ESG a fad? Is it going away? I say, look, all you really need to do is follow the money. And the money is staggering, right? There is a global wall of capital chasing impact investment and ESG investment and sustainable investment. So for those who are mathematically challenged here, the first number is 715 billion. These are assets specifically designated as impact investments at the end of 2020. Impact meaning they are prioritizing an impact, a social or environmental good over financial return. Okay, that was sort of the historical genesis of what became known as ESG investing. The bottom number is even more challenging, 40 trillion with a T, currently sitting in sustainable investment strategies around the world, right? 40 trillion with a T. So when people come to me and say, you know, should I get involved in ESG? When my daughter asks me what she should do with her career, I say, look, there's 40 trillion chasing this market. It is going to be put to work. And the good news for someone at an earlier stage of his or her career is that it's a relatively new field. You know, so there isn't this entrenched layer of talent sort of impeding progress or career progression. It's a very new and youthful and dynamic market that really caters to young rising stars and investment professionals. So, you know, the traditional background around ESG investing, it really grew out of philanthropy. And they talk about the spectrum of investment. So on this slide, you see on the right-hand side is impact investing. So pure philanthropic grant making, basically giving money away to good causes around the world. And that evolved into sort of impact investing, where impact was the main priority. If you could break even, that was great, et cetera. So that was sort of, you know, the right-hand side of this scale. So the social responsible side of the equation. The far left-hand side is the for-profit crowd. These are the investment managers, the private equity firms, hedge funds, you name it, people trying to earn a return on their investments. They also have a fiduciary duty to do exactly that. So they weren't really that interested in impact at the time. And so when we began working on this within Russell Reynolds, I began seeing a narrowing of the spectrum, because all of a sudden the impact crowd on the right began to realize that if they can actually earn a return on their money, they can have an even greater impact. This is a good thing. Simultaneously, the people on the left, you know, the hardcore investors, asset managers, private equity, began to realize that by incorporating ESG metrics or impact-driven metrics into their investment processes, they could actually generate a higher return. So anytime you can generate a higher return, that's a good thing for the for-profit crowd. So we began to see a narrowing of the spectrum, slowly and gradually, but it's accelerating now. And now we're seeing this in terms of talent. There is a cross-pollination of talent back and forth, where the for-profit firms are hiring people from the impact side, and the impact side are hiring people from the for-profit side. So it's all coming together, and it really is in response to this massive wall of global capital chasing impact and sustainable investment strategies. So the pressure for this is coming from everywhere. You know, as Larry Fink would say, you know, climate risk is investment risk. You know, there is no way around it. It is literally impossible to divorce ESG metrics from any credible 21st century investment process. And we can debate that as much as you want. But basically, the pressure is coming from investors, putting pressures on companies to create measurement and reporting frameworks around ESG. And if they don't do that, the investors will divest of their stock. It's a lot of pressure on corporates and on CEOs and boards. But the pressure is also coming from everyone on this call, the consumers. People are making brand equity purchasing decisions based upon a product that they know has been created sustainably. Nobody wants to buy a product made by, you know, slave labor in Asia, or that's degrading the environmental system somewhere in the world. So brand equity decisions are driving a lot of demand for sustainable products. People will pay more for sustainable products. It's being driven by employees, next generation leadership, the millennials, Gen Z, etc., will not work for a firm if that firm isn't mission driven. They want to make money, but they also want there to be a bigger purpose assigned to the corporate strategy of the firm. So it's the 3 Ps. It's people, planet, and profit. Profit's very important, but so is purpose. So now companies have to demonstrate to their employees how they synthesize both of that into a working arrangement. The pressure's coming from regulators, the government's getting on board. The US is behind Europe, but we're catching up rather quickly. And then supply chain risks. Again, Nestle and other firms have made a massive investment in improving the sustainability of their supply chains to make better products, and they're being reflected in that by higher market share. We ask a lot of companies where they are in their ESG life cycle, and what's happened is ESG used to be viewed as sort of a necessary evil, kind of a functional requirement. We have to check the box on this thing. It's kind of a pain in the neck. But now, best-in-class companies recognize the commercial benefits of having a best-in-class ESG program, because if you go back to the prior slide, they're going to gain favor with investors. They're going to have higher market share from their consumers. They're going to be able to attract and retain the best employees and stay out of trouble with the government, right? So these are not functional roles anymore. This is not a functional box checking necessary evil, if you will. These are business value creation roles that are engendering outperformance in the companies who have them. ESG leaders really need to interface with an incredibly wide array of stakeholders. And so people say, where do you find these people? At the end of the day, they have to have incredible interpersonal skills and connectivity to really resonate credibly with an incredibly wide array of both business, functional, and external stakeholders. So that really is the key to being an effective ESG leader. And if you want to think about, the activity in this space right now, if you go on to LinkedIn and you click on the jobs tab and you just do a search for ESG, there are 7,000 jobs today, right now, just in the US, related to ESG and sustainability. It is a massive dynamic. Companies cannot hire these people fast enough. So where do they come from? The great news is it's a very diverse talent pool. Last year, over 70% of the newly appointed ESG leaders were female. The vast majority of them, 93%, were hired externally. They're bringing in new functions, new capabilities. They have a business background, not a legal background, not a compliance background, not a marketing background. These are business people first who are able to translate a sustainable mindset into business value creation. So we're not talking about people coming in, and just, not applying fundamental business priorities to their roles, but they're doing it in a very sustainable way. And that's new, and that's what's different. If you can see this chart, I don't know, hopefully you can see. So this is just, we try to track the high level people moves in the ESG space. It is shocking. I mean, just since January of this year, last month, Oak Hill Advisors, AEA, Standard Chartered, American Century, General Atlantic, Franklin Templeton, JP Morgan, and UBS in the past 2 months have hired heads of ESG. And that's just the ones that I can keep track of. There are more behind that. And every month there's just another massive wave of hiring in this space because it's become so important and really table stakes in the investment world to have these senior leaders on your team. Outperformance comes and goes. In 2020, it outperformed massively. 2021, less so. But at the end of the day, like I said before, the flows are overwhelming, and a lot of this will drive performance because more and more flows are going into sustainable investment strategies, and that drives additional performance. But at the end of the day, would you really want to invest in a company or in a product that's going to be against the law in the next 5 or 10 years? I probably wouldn't. So the subjectivity there is there around what defines an ESG investment. Again, that's a longer conversation, but the flow of capital into this space is overwhelming and unrelenting and unlikely to stop anytime soon. So I'll pause there and turn it over to Bo. Bo, you're on mute.
Forgive me. Alex, would you take it from here and lead us into some of the things that you're studying and working on, and some of the alternative solutions that are out there, and how attractive you think those are?
Sure thing. Also, thank you to the Lifelong Learning team for the invitation to come and speak, and thank you to Professor Casey for introducing me. And thank you, Kurt, for the fantastic overview of ESG. I thought that was fantastic. So let me share my screen and we'll get going. Okay, is this looking good? Okay, great. So we're going to be talking about the state of climate tech investing. My name is Alex. I'm a Washington and Lee class of 2014 alum. And right now I'm getting my MBA at Sloan as well as my MPA at the Kennedy School. I think you guys have my credentials and have my resume and introduction and everything. But I think that what's probably more important is to understand why climate matters to me. At WNL, I studied econ, politics, and I was a poverty and human capability studies minor. And I really didn't have anything to do with climate. After graduation, I moved to India. And I started working on a project with an NGO focused on human trafficking. And when I was working with this NGO, I started to see the connection between issues like water and climate change and how that impacts different communities. Because basically what was happening in these communities was that the water table in Rajasthan dropped by 67% in the last decade. Monsoon patterns were dramatically changing, and most of these agricultural communities couldn't produce crops in the way that they used to. So they would end up sending their daughters to work in cotton fields in Gujarat. They would work in construction sites in major cities, and along the way they would end up getting trafficked. So for me, climate is an environmental issue, but it's really a human issue, and that's why it matters to me. So as I started to unpack this problem, I started to try to learn as much as I could about climate. And I spent the last 5 years in India before grad school in impact investing, and this kind of became my passion interest. So what I started to learn is that CO2 is being released into the atmosphere faster than at any time in the last 66 million years. And if we look at what's happening with CO2 concentrations and how temperature typically falls in line with these fluctuations of CO2, the question is where we're at now. And this basically goes back from 0 to 800,000 years. That 0 is, I think, around 1960. And this was the 2019 concentrations. And then the question that I had was, what happens if we do nothing? And if we see the fluctuations in temperature and how that coincides with CO2 concentrations, that got me very scared. So studies show that if we do nothing about climate, we're going to see losses of $792 trillion in the economy. We're potentially seeing 85 million deaths around the world, and that mostly comes from marginalized communities. Wealthy people will be able to adapt and change. We'll see 50% biodiversity loss, and there could potentially be 2 billion climate refugees around the world. And to counter that, for me, if we're doing a cost-benefit analysis, studies show that we need $9 trillion of investment per year until, I think, 2030 or 2050. This is 2050. And basically what we need right now is an additional 3.5 trillion per year. So just cost benefit analysis, to me, this is an easy bet. So what do we actually have to decarbonize? There are around 51 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions that are being emitted into the atmosphere every year. 73% comes from energy, around 18.4 from agriculture, and then a little bit from waste as well as industry. Now, what's exciting is that, you have the CEO of BlackRock. Apparently, we're big Larry Fink fans here. But he says that the next 1,000 unicorns, that's billion-dollar companies, are going to come from climate tech. So that's green hydrogen, agriculture, steel, cement, and the likes. What's interesting, though, is most of the VC capital that's going into climate tech right now is really in mobility and transport. And if we look at the different opportunities, basically, there are incredible opportunities to make a lot of fantastic businesses in the space that we've barely even tapped into. So the goal of climate tech investing is not only to build great businesses, but to really drive down what we call the green premium. And basically, a lot of these technologies are far too expensive right now to deliver. And really what's going to make this work is if we can make these solutions cost equivalent or cheaper to incumbents. Right now, there are a lot of hard to abate sectors. So, we have the power sector, but things like building, cement, oil and gas, aviation, these are really hard to decarbonize industries. So there are a couple of segments that we'll kind of dive into. The first is how we charge and how we create energy. So you have companies like Commonwealth Fusion Systems, and this is an MIT-founded startup. They just raised $1.8 billion in their Series B, which is insane, but they do fusion energy. And I work part-time at a tough tech VC fund that spun out of MIT called The Engine. And what's really funny is when I go to work, I park my bike in the back, and there's this glass door with a sheet of computer paper, and it just says CFS Magnet Room, because those are the magnets that they're using to create fusion energy. So Commonwealth is one of those. You also have energy storage companies like Antor and Form. Form is another an MIT-founded startup. There's Dandelion and Quaise Energy that do geothermal. And then Solstice is really focused on solar energy for low-income communities. But if we look at the global energy sources, what's a little bit disappointing to see is that we've only reduced fossil fuel consumption by 2% since 2000, and that's around 84% of global energy right now. So there's a lot of work to be done to reduce emissions from fossil fuels. The next is how we move. I figure there's a big name there that most people recognize, which is Tesla. And they kind of tackle the road passenger sector. But there are a lot of different sectors that have to be decarbonized as well. You have freight and fleet vehicles. So heavy duty trucks is one of those difficult to decarbonize industries as well. There are people working on electrification solutions, but also hydrogen as well, because that route cycle really changes the way that you can actually use the technology. There's Hart Aerospace as well as Joby Aviation, and they do electric aviation. LanzaJet is creating sustainable aviation fuels. And ARC as well as Boundary Layer Technologies are creating shipping solutions that are basically decarbonizing shipping. If we look at what we make, we're looking at industry, right? And industry is another really challenging sector that I find really interesting because it's so dependent on policy. Iron and steel accounts for 27% of CO2 emissions in industry, followed by cement, which is 27%, and chemicals, which is 15%. So Boston Metal and Green Steel, H2 Green Steel, are companies that are creating green steel. And basically, they're decoupling from coke usage as well as fossil fuel usage in steel. CarbonCure as well as Sublime Systems are looking at decarbonizing cement. And Solugen is a really interesting company as well. And basically, they use bio-based sugar feedstocks to create petroleum chemicals, or petroleum chemicals. And then via separations and osmosis are companies that are able to separate chemicals, which reduces emissions. So if we look at what we eat, This is actually a really fun sector to have to do due diligence on. Over the summer, I got to do due diligence on a company called Nobel, and they create plant-based cheeses. So they actually genetically modify soybeans to create casein, which is the protein in cheese that makes it stretchy and melty. So we got to have a wine tasting and cheese tasting as our due diligence process. Impossible Foods, I'm sure most of you have heard of. There's Memphis Meats that creates lab-based proteins. Every is the company that creates alternative eggs. Wild Type creates alternative salmon. And Compound Coffee is basically creating a coffee substitute. Then you also have different agricultural inputs. So Pivot Bio is working on climate positive fertilizers. And then you also look at companies like Spoiler Alert and Appeal Sciences, which helps with food waste. And then there's where we live. Retrofitting is a very important solution that is really hard to work on. Companies like Sealed are working on that, Block Power as well. And then you have companies that are working on modular homes as well as 3D printed homes to make the process of buildings more efficient as well as sustainable. And then there's the question of how we actually get to net zero. And this is where technologies like carbon capture, utilization, and storage come into play, as well as nature-based solutions. Companies like Pachama are they're basically producing forests. And companies like Carbon Engineering are direct air capture companies. And Carbon America basically does project finance for carbon removal. But basically, what a lot of people are saying is that we're actually not going to hit these 1.5 degrees Celsius targets unless we actually have carbon removal as part of the solutions as well. Which brings us to carbon markets. This is something that I'm very interested in. And basically, you have compulsory carbon markets as well as voluntary carbon markets. And what's very exciting to see right now is that there are a lot of companies that have been making these climate commitments, and this has just grown exponentially. And in order to actually be able to reach these commitments, they're going to have to work with companies that are removing carbon either through nature-based solutions or technology-based solutions, and they're going to have to pay for that. So this is actually a really compelling solution to actually drive adoption of climate technology and promote investment in the space as well. But the problem is that climate tech is just one part of the solution. There's so much more that has to come into play as well. Policy is huge. If we don't have a price on carbon, then a lot of this will not scale the way that it should. We need political activism. We need different stakeholders to actually engage in these conversations. And we need a lot more investment in the space as well. So what I always think about and what I daydream about is what a decarbonized world will look like. And I think that if I have anything to leave you guys with, the question that I really want you to think about is like, what could a better world be? And what could that work like? What could that look like for our futures? So I think I will stop there and we can go to Q&A.
Alex, thank you. Fascinating, and thank you all three panelists tonight. I'm gonna take the moderator's privilege and ask the first question, and I'll limit it to Kurt because it is an ESG question, and we have a handful of really good questions that our curators are ready to ask for all of you. But the question arises from a gentleman named Tariq Fancy, who used to be at a pretty prominent firm called BlackRock. And he is perhaps the leading critic of the entire notion of ESG investing. He has written that focus on ESG are profitable for Wall Street, but amount to a dangerous placebo that does not cure the planet's problems. He's gone further to say ESG integration into existing investment processes can't point to any real world impact that would not have otherwise occurred. I'm not informed about this contrasting view, but it is a pretty stark, different way of looking at the views that the three of you have expressed. Kurt, you must be familiar with him. You must be familiar with what we'll call the contrarian view. Comment on it, and then we'll turn to Rob and Ruth to lead additional questions.
Yeah, no, look, it's a great question and very topical. And as I mentioned, markets ebb and flow, and ESG has outperformed for a very long time. It's underperformed this year. So the naysayers are having their day as we speak. Part of that is because a lot of the investments that are in these ESG funds, let's say, are the types of companies that Alex just talked about. Technology, green tech, fintech, renewables, things like that have had a massive run in 2020 and for most of 2021. And the tech downtrade in 2022, these ESG funds have done very poorly, as have most tech-oriented portfolios. So I think the issue is not that ESG funds can solve the climate crisis or ESG investing can end poverty, right? No one's claiming that. At the end of the day, ESG investing is just smart investing, and it's not changing investment processes that have been successful for the past 40, 50, 60 years. It's layering on another dimension on top of that will, over the long run, generate better returns. Over the long run, fossil fuels will be out of business. It may not happen in the next 10 years, but it's going to happen eventually. So depending upon your time horizon, you can decide if you want to invest in a company or an industry or a product that's going to be out of business at some point, potentially even outlawed or regulated against. A lot of the discrepancies come in how to define a sustainable investment. So for example, Professor Casey and Alex both talked about Tesla, right? Is Tesla an ESG investment? Some would say, well, obviously it is. They're making, cars that don't have any carbon footprint. It's zero emission cars. Obviously it's an ESG investment. Others would say, well, hang on a second. Where are they making these batteries? What's the labor conditions in those factories? And what are they doing with the battery runoff? Where is all that going from a climate perspective or an environment perspective? Plus you have the CEO videotaping himself on YouTube smoking marijuana. That's probably not the best governance, which is the G of ESG. So you can go back and forth, Same thing with British Petroleum, right? BP, the biggest fossil fuel player on the planet. We did a search for the chief sustainability officer for BP. Fascinating search, right? So we called some people and the response we got was, BP, I hope they die. I hope they go out of business. I would never work for BP. And we're like, okay. Others with the exact same credentials and background would say, wow, BP, I can be part of the energy transition for the biggest player on the planet. I'm in, right? So it all depends on how you define what is a suitable, quote unquote, ESG investment.
Rob and Ruth, take it away. There are more questions waiting. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Kurt, for that that response to the question from Bo. Matt Wallace wants to get us away from theory down to the granular level, Jim, and he has a question for you, and I hope you can help us think about practical steps. He asks, is there value in intermediate steps to store carbon geologically as a means to transition from fossil fuels to a renewable energy infrastructure, especially given the tax credit that provides incentive to invest in reducing carbon in the atmosphere at a large scale? Have you ever heard of that technology, Jim?
Yeah, carbon capture and storage has been around for quite some time. And in the early 2000s, I was highly in favor of carbon capture and storage. Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who's an atmospheric chemist that I rely on pretty heavily for my understanding of these types of issues, has suggested that it may be too late for carbon capture and storage, that may have flown the coop. And then yet I saw Alex's slide that she put up that suggests, no, what really might be too late is that we now need to geoengineer, and we're going to have to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it back in the mantle somewhere, right? Or close to the mantle where it came from. So yes, of course, there's tremendous value in it. There was a paper by Dan Schrag at Harvard probably almost 20 years ago that suggested we could take all of the carbon emissions from the burning of coal in the United States, capture it all, and place it on the continental shelf off the eastern seaboard, where it would turn into hard sediment and lay there at the bottom of the ocean to the tune of maybe $100 billion a year. That would be it. Again, there's sort of mixed results now, I think, in terms of thinking, does it simply provide an avenue to continue to burn hydrocarbons? Or is it going to become a necessary part of the portfolio, as Alex showed, that we may not be able to meet the targets? Actually, there's no way we're going to meet the 1.5 centigrade target. I just don't think that that's even possible now without some sort of geoengineering and removal from the atmosphere of carbon. So
thanks, Jim. Alex, do you have a thought following up?
Yeah. So geologic sequestration is already being used for enhanced oil recovery. But if you look at it in terms of like climate positive sequestration, basically what studies are showing is that nature-based solutions are more cost effective at this point in time. And we won't really see cost effectiveness of using technological sequestration for carbon removal in that respect until like 2030 to 2040.
Okay, thank you. Ruth.
So I'm going to combine a couple of questions in the chat. And one question is, why shouldn't we all be eating a plant-based diet? And then the other question is, why should we be investing in industrial meat and dairy alternatives that use soy, one of the most problematic crops, as opposed to livestock farms that are using regular agriculture practices? Sure. And Alex, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Yeah, it would be great if everybody adopted a plant-based diet, but I think that human habit change is one of the most challenging problems of the climate crisis. I don't think that people will be adopting plant-based diets. It would be wonderful, but I don't think it's going to happen. So having solutions that can, basically give alternatives that people can adopt is better than nothing. In terms of sustainable agriculture, one of the biggest reasons why the agricultural industry and the livestock industry is so bad for the environment is not only because of methane emissions from cattle, but also deforestation. So if you're removing those different carbon sinks, then that is a major issue as well. So the land use is a major, major problem for agriculture.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Chad Ellis asked a question, and I think probably, Jim, this is for you. He says he likes energy prices low, surprise, $2 a gallon or equivalent. But then he talks about the proposed taxes and shifts to alternatives that will require significant capital and risk. And he asks, what is the expected energy cost of the future as we make that move bolstered by huge taxes? And then the impact of those taxes on billions of people who currently live on a few dollars a day.
Sure. Chad, thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. Everybody likes low prices, but oftentimes low prices come with very high costs. And so the idea that you would like to pay $2 a gallon for your gasoline means you're passing off a cost onto everybody else, which are the environmental externalities of the burning of those hydrocarbons. And so then we need to address the question of the fairness and the equity of paying a price for fuel that doesn't reflect the actual cost associated with it. To answer the question of what would the price of a gallon of gasoline look like if all of the externalities were internalized, it'd be like $10 a gallon. There's no doubt about it. And that is exactly the point, which is to actually use resources in an efficient manner. Having said that, your equity question is an excellent question. And I do not believe that we should, on the backs of the poorest of the poor, deal with climate change. Therefore, there's a whole conversation right now about climate reparations that is taking place, whereby those of us who are primarily responsible, and I say us because of course I'm in that category as well. You can see the lights above my head. It's nicely conditioned here in this office space. I'm using the internet, et cetera, are passing those costs off onto others. And the idea that somehow the bottom billion or 2 billion would somehow have to pay more for these things, no, I think that's completely inappropriate. And through the mechanism of the Sustainable Development Goals and the commitments that the 30 OECD countries have made, if we simply hit those targets in terms of our assistance for developing countries, we could actually help them provide clean energy resources for themselves to produce and consume that would actually not, right, emit the greenhouse gases, lead to the air pollution types of effects, and do it at a lower cost than is currently the case. Domestically, in terms of the equity issue, all of the climate tax proposals come with what's called a dividend, where the money that is raised through the tax or through the auction of those climate permits gets redistributed to the general population. The conservative case for a climate tax and dividend actually shows that 70% of households in the US actually see their disposable income rise, even though energy costs rise, because the dividend to each of those households is greater than the extra cost associated with the increase in the fuel price. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on to address all of those questions, and I appreciate it.
Good. Alex, Kurt, would you like to weigh in on that question? No? Okay, well, let's then move on. Ruth?
How can regulation accelerate the availability of and access to renewable energy sources? Permitting, siting, constructing, and operation often seem burdened by complex regulations. And by the way, it's a great program. Thank you. Jim, you want to take that one first?
I guess I could start. And the thing that economists have been arguing for a long time, actually even before James Hansen first testified in front of Congress in 1988 or 89, is a price on carbon. That would be the very first thing that would level the playing field for non-hydrocarbon energy sources. And so I think that's still the simplest, most straightforward solution, is to take advantage of what markets do best, which is to send price signals that are based on the full costs so that firms can adjust and we can see investment move in the directions that will make it more profitable to invest in those other industries. I don't know a whole lot about the regulatory framework and the bureaucracy associated with that, other than as a general theory, right? Anytime we can eliminate those costs, obviously we should be doing so. If somebody else knows more about that, please feel free.
Alex or Kurt?
No, I mean, I will add that there are major blockages in terms of regulation, especially for technologies that barely even have entered the market, right? If you have new technologies like nuclear or fusion that, the policy frameworks aren't really in place and the regulatory frameworks aren't established yet, then, it creates a lot of obstacles for these technologies to scale in ways that, we do have to fix pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think Professor Casey nailed it. I mean, we continually hear that the most important development really around all of this, and this feeds into biodiversity loss as well as climate change, is getting a globally agreed upon carbon price. There are regional carbon prices, but there's no standard. So it's almost like oil, right? There's a price for Dubai, and there's a price for North Sea Brent. There's a price for West Texas Intermediate. It depends on where you're delivering it and where it's being supplied and stored. But carbon is carbon, right? Carbon is the same all around the world. So if we can get a global carbon price, that would be a massive, massive benefit to the world and to future generations. The issue is you get into global geopolitics.
Good. Thank you, Mike. Mike Carr has a question. He's obviously uncomfortable about the current costs of alternative energy. And he says that the panel has said that a carbon tax is necessary to scale alternatives. But if alternative energy costs substantially more than oil, will ESG create substantially more income inequality? Who would like to take that?
I can start. I don't know how to address the last part of the question, so if somebody else could, but the first part of the question, again, I referred to Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who's the head of the Center for Energy and the Environment at Stanford. His latest calculations, if you look at the, I forget what it's called, the long cap, it's basically trying to understand what it costs to build energy infrastructure and then supply it out to the market. Wind and solar have been reduced by over 90% in the last decade and a half. And from a purely financial standpoint right now, it's actually cheaper to build wind and solar than it is to build another coal-fired utility or even a nuclear reactor for that matter. On a per kilowatt hour basis, wind and solar are less expensive. So even without a carbon tax, that movement is already underway. And I think to the ESG space that Kurt was referring to earlier, you see dollars moving in that direction, and that's why. The carbon tax, again, would speed up this process in a way, again, because it would reflect the true cost of what's happening. But even without that, we're already seeing a movement towards alternative. The income inequity question, I would have to think about that for a while before addressing that.
Good.
I think I've heard it well stated that the world's first trillionaire will be a green tech entrepreneur. And it could be Alex, it could be somebody else on the call, probably not me, but that is where it's going.
Ruth, do you have another question?
Josh Helzer asked Alex if you would like to address the low-hanging fruit of reducing methane leaks from natural gas pipelines. The Washington Post article on the front page set this up pre-Glasgow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that reducing methane emissions, so for those that aren't aware, methane is 80 times higher global warming potential than CO2. So it's a really huge problem. The biggest solution that we have is reducing demand for fossil fuels. If we don't require as much natural gas, then there won't be as much methane released into the atmosphere. There are some interesting technologies. I was reading a report recently about some sort of clay that can be used to capture methane from natural gas pipelines. And basically, it's the same sort of clay that's used in cat litter. So there are interesting technologies that are on the horizon, but I think that the best solution we have for that is just to reduce demand.
Good.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask the panel if they have questions of each other at this point from what you've all been listening acutely to each other's presentations. I wonder if you'd like to take a minute or so and ask each other a question from what you've heard tonight.
So Alex, if I can I come back to the carbon capture and storage sort of question? Because I'm torn on how to teach that aspect of climate policy. Again, I was very pro CCS 20 years ago, and I'm not sure where I am today. And I'm wondering if you can give me any insights into, what should students be learning about either the importance of or the boondoggle of, or somewhere in the middle of carbon capture and storage. What do you think?
I think they should learn about the boondoggle. So one of my professors at Harvard, David Keith, he was the founder of Carbon Engineering. And the company's still going, but he's kind of withdrawn from this concept of carbon removal just because he doesn't think that it's, what people should be focusing on. On the other hand, there are tons of studies that show that it's going to be an absolute necessity. We are just not going to hit the targets that we have to hit. So having some sort of carbon removal solution is important. And then there's the difference between nature-based solutions and technological solutions, right? So looking at, different types of, I guess, pros and cons of each sort of technology and each sort of solution is important. With nature-based, the issue of permanence comes into play. With technology-based, the issue of cost comes into play, right? So understanding just the pros and cons of each of those sorts of solutions is a great education in itself. Kurt, I have a question for you. So I think that one of the biggest problems with ESG companies is that, there's not a concrete way to define what ESG is. And there's something called the Aggregate Confusion Project, which I think basically said that you can't actually pinpoint the same. I think that the only 20 companies within 500 companies based on third-party estimates actually show up consistently throughout multiple third-party estimates. So how does the, I guess, big picture financial sector look at that sort of volatility and lack of concrete ESG metrics?
Yeah, that's what makes a market, right? A lack of standardization. And, you could also apply that to taxonomy, right? Where there's no gap accounting rules for sustainable investments. So a lot of it comes down to materiality, right? So what we advise our clients on, because our clients come to us and say, we're ABC company, our investors are really putting a lot of pressure on us to be more sustainable. I mean, where do we begin? There's 50 different ESG metrics. So our first point of advice to them is figure out from a materiality perspective, which dimensions are relevant to you and your business and your company and your sector and your geography. And they're going to be different for every company because there's a 0% chance that any company can check the box on all the different ESG metrics. So pick the 5 or 6 most important and material dimensions and create a strategy around how you're going to address them specifically. Because if you do that and you do it credibly, investors will reward you and put you in the ESG friendly bucket.
Gotcha. And then a follow-up question on that is, what are your thoughts on engine number 1?
So it depends on who you talk to. Again, some will say that was a governance failure. I would say, well, if it's a governance failure, there are a lot of other companies in the S&P 500 with worse governance than ExxonMobil. Why didn't engine number 1 go after them? Okay, so I think it's not just a governance failure. But there were a lot of lessons came out of that. And I think, it really sort of opened people's eyes to the pressures they're going to face. Investor activism is not going away. And like I said, it's almost table stakes now that you have to have a credible ESG measurement and reporting framework and a corporate strategy around it. Because if you don't, you will fall pressure to investor activism. So you saw the slide of all the different companies hiring heads of ESG. They're doing that to create these measurement and reporting frameworks to fend off any potential investor activism. So I think what they did was incredible. And people who say it was a governance issue are missing the bigger picture.
Well, folks, it falls to me to bring us to a close. Thank you more than we can say to Jim Casey, to Kurt Harrison, and to Alex Prather for bringing our series to such an enlightening close. Really, really terrific, thought-provoking comments and questions tonight. There is a tremendous amount to think and learn about. And thanks to our audience, all of you, for being with us this evening. Many of you, I'm sure, in prior sessions, and for your good questions. Once again, the Q&A session is what makes this so tremendously rewarding for all of us, and we hope for you. We hope the sustainability series has met your expectations. It's been our pleasure to present it to you. Alumni Engagement is committed to offering intellectual content through our Lifelong Learning Office. Please pick from many different offerings from Alumni Engagement, including virtual presentations like this one, a digital book club, faculty podcasts, campus reunions, local alumni chapter events, the summer alumni college sessions on campus, and a very acclaimed worldwide travel program. You can find all of that information on our website, of course, at www.alumni.wlu.edu. Thank you. Good night. Stay connected with your university. Thanks for being here.